Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. Today I'm joined by Dr. Sam Edwards, who is an associate professor of history at Loughborough University in the UK. He's a public historian, as well as a military historian, a fellow Fulbright scholar, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Sam is author of Allies in Memory and has published widely on US-UK relations, war memory, and commemoration. He's a trustee of Soulgrave Manor, of the American Library, and of the D-Day Story. Sam, it is great to finally have a chance to meet with you sort of in person, but definitely in real time, and hear about your work on the US-UK relationship. I'm looking forward to delving into publications that you have previously published on this topic, as well as hear about a book that you're currently working on.
It's a real pleasure to join you, Heather. I feel like we've got so much kind of in common here in terms of our interests. I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
Yeah, that's right. I first would like to hear how you became interested in this historical and very special US-UK relationship.
So it all goes back to my teenage years, ultimately. So I'm from a little village on the east coast of England in the county of Suffolk, which has various kind of significant historical connections to the United States. But probably the big one of the 20th century is that during the Second World War, Suffolk and the surrounding area was effectively occupied by the United States military. So by the eve of D-Day, 1944, there's about 1.6 million American GIs in the UK. And of those 1.6 million, about 400,000 are just in the eastern counties of England. And one consequence of that was that when I was growing up in the region in the 1990s, kind of 50 years after the end of the war, I was still very conscious of the legacy of that World War II presence. It was an era in which veterans were returning for pilgrimages to return to the airfields that they flew from during the war, and to build memorials. So I became really kind of aware of it there in the 1990s. And on one level, I've stuck with that subject ever since.
Stuck with it. What were some of the impressions that you gleaned from local residents about the Americans? I can imagine there were a number of people who either had firsthand memory of interacting with these American soldiers, but certainly the stories that were passed down through the families would have existed by the time you're living in the area.
Yeah, it's a fascinating history, and it was certainly the case that in the 1980s, 1990s, 40, 50 years after, for some of those that lived the moment themselves, so especially the kind of the kids that were, that is kids in the 1940s that 50 years later, then their 60s, 70s, for some of these, it was still a fresh memory, and there was very fond memories of the American presence. The story of the friendly invasion, as it's called, is complicated, and it's absolutely the case that there were moments of transatlantic tension within. But it's also the case that there were friendships forged and formed, and that those friendships lingered into the post-war period. And for some of the kids that witnessed the American arrival and that American presence, lots of fond memories still lingering into the 1950s, into the 1990s, 50 years after the invasion.
So I am imagining exactly how you would have had a natural interest in the American presence. How did that segue into your scholarship on the topic?
So it began when I was an undergraduate student. So my third year at a UK university, Lancaster University in the northwest of England, like so many third-year programs in UK universities, and similar across the pond, I know as well, kind of the capstone thing was the dissertation, was the kind of the extended research project, which was personally shaped and defined. So it's kind of something I had to come up with. And I remember talking to the academics in the department, trying to get some ideas as to what I could do for that project. And in the end, I latched on to doing something on the US 8th Air Force. So the 8th Air Force was that organization which occupied Eastern England during the course of the Second World War. And originally, I was going to do something on the kind of the social history of that American presence. But as the project developed, it became increasingly apparent that stuff had been written about the social history, about those encounters between Brits and Yanks, but less had been done on its aftermath, on its legacy, on the things that I had witnessed myself in the 1990s of veterans returning and the pilgrimages and the memorials and the memorial ceremonies. So I decided for my third year undergraduate project that I'd focus on that, the commemoration of the 8th Air Force. And kind of it all began there. And from that, I then expanded the project and the focus as I worked my way through, masters and PhD, and then ultimately into my first book.
These journeys that you were witnessing, were they called pilgrimages at the time?
Interestingly, yes, at least in terms of how many veterans described what they were doing, and also in terms of how contemporary press reports were describing. So there was lots of press coverage of the Yanks coming back in the 1990s, and often the headlines were along the lines of emotional pilgrimage of American veterans back to their airfield. And so it did come through in the language of media coverage, but it's also a language that the veterans themselves, I think, picked up on and used in some of their accounts.
It's interesting because I haven't really delved so much into the return journeys or pilgrimages of World War II veterans. Primarily, I've been working in the World War One, post World War One space, which is, I mean, pilgrimage is kind of burgeoning at this time, and everyone's going on pilgrimages. And the World War One veterans were returning to France or Belgium, or in some cases the UK, and or Britain. And these journeys are kind of nested into this larger global phenomena, pilgrimage phenomena. Uh, but I am wondering because it sort of fell off. This idea of pilgrimages sort of fell off after World War II. And so, do you see this use of the word pilgrimage kind of across the board with World War II veterans, or is it something specific to American veterans?
That's a really good question. I don't think it's necessarily specific or exclusive to American veterans, and I've certainly seen discussion of similar activities that, say, British veterans were involved in, heading to Normandy in this same period, and other veterans from other countries returning to the UK and to Europe, Canadian veterans. So I think that language is there, but certainly in my experience, it did strike me that it was especially present and prevalent in some of the discussions of American veterans returning to England and also to Europe more broadly from the 1980s onwards, really. I think that's where it really kind of kicks off and really kind of gains momentum.
Mhm. Are commemoration ceremonies always a part of these pilgrimages?
Sometimes, but not always. And so, one of the things I looked at in my work was I was trying to figure out when was the activity happening and what did it look like at different moments. And I think straight after 1945, there was a 10, 15-year period where there was some memorial building and some dedicating of memorials, but not necessarily much in the way of organized pilgrimages. It happened occasionally here and there, but not on a particularly widespread scale, at least when compared to then from the 1980s, 1990s, as we head towards the 21st century, much more happening. And this is a period in which you see pilgrimages undertaken with the specific purpose of dedicating a commemorative structure, a monument, a memorial, but sometimes they also just happen for the activity themselves. There's not necessarily a dedication at the end of it. Often there's maybe a ceremony or something on the site that's sacred, the airfield in an East Anglian context, but it didn't necessarily always have to culminate in a monument.
Yeah, that's very similar, I think, to the post World War One pilgrimages. What are some of the monuments that were established or memorial spaces?
So enormous numbers. So hundreds of monuments and memorials were established in the two regions that were the focus of my PhD work and then also of my book. So one was Eastern England, where the 8th Air Force was present, and then the other was Normandy in northwest France, obviously the site of the D-Day landings.
Mhm.
And both those locations, an enormous number of monuments, memorials established in the 80s and 90s. If I focus just on England for a moment, interesting in terms of their type and also in terms of their location. there's a real emphasis in the final decade of the 20th century, the 1990s, in establishing a commemorative structure on the site of the airfield itself. So real interest in making sure that this space, which is so important to the veterans for so many reasons, is marked, and almost that its sanctity is therefore acknowledged and accepted. And the monuments take a relatively consistent forms. Often it's structures of polished black marble. Often they incorporate the iconography of the formation, the insignia, maybe a representation of the aircraft that was flown from that base. And usually it was a B-24 Liberator bomber, or sometimes a B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. So it's that kind of iconography, the iconography that you might expect from a group of veterans returning to kind of pay homage to their youth and to their past. So it's that sort of thing happening on the airfields. But then elsewhere, some interesting monuments and memorials established as well. The other type that I find really powerful and evocative are the stained glass windows established in rural parish churches. Often they were older. Often these were the things that went up in the 40s and 50s. But they're incredibly powerful, incredibly evocative, and I'm just working on a book at the moment which is going to account for all of these diverse commemorative styles.
Mm. I was going to ask about stained glass windows. That has definitely been a focal point of my work in the Bello, France church, which the whole church is a division memorial. So the stained glass windows were all new. None of them are original. But it's fascinating to me to consider this synthesis of war and religion it's almost its own type of spirituality. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That there's a real sense with the activities that I was examining, that it did at times have either a quasi-religious kind of quality to, or at times, a very clear and direct, almost explicit religious quality. One that comes to mind for me here is one of my favorite stained glass windows of this era of activity goes up actually in 1944 originally. So the war's not yet done, but originally goes up in 1944 in a small little parish church, St Andrews, in the village of Quiddenham, which is in Norfolk, kind of the southwestern corner of Norfolk. So there's Norfolk and there's Suffolk. If you imagine the eastern England, that kind of rounded hump of England, Norfolk and then Suffolk, and this is a little village towards the border of those two counties. The window goes up in 1944, and there's a ceremony at which it's dedicated, but then it is rededicated on Memorial Day of 1946. And it is dedicated by the parish curate, by the vicar. It is a very deliberately, religious occasion, religious affair. I think there's also a chaplain from the U.S. Army Air Force present as well. There's a crowd in the church. The proceedings are actually recorded by the BBC, so that they can be broadcast across the Atlantic to the United States. And the New York Times even picks up on this story. One of the famous British correspondents, war correspondents, Dimbleby is his surname, actually does the narration. Actually does the commentary for this occasion. So it is a political occasion. It's a transatlantic occasion. It's a diplomatic occasion. But given the environment, this is also very much a religious occasion as well.
What is depicted in the window?
So the window shows an American airman who has sacrificed his life, looking up to a vision of Christ, and with the idea being that he is being accepted into the eternal, into the ever after. And he's depicted above a wonderfully bucolic pastoral scene of rural England. So there's a little scene of Quiddenham, the village, a scene of the church, and in the sky over above, in the billowing kind of cumulonimbus clouds, there are just little representations of the aircraft that were flying from the base nearby. So I find it such a striking bit of imagery in terms of how it brings together so many interesting themes.
Do these windows themselves become a place of pilgrimage, or is it the church? I'm thinking about pilgrims coming or travelers and leaving some type of artifact at the base of the window. In some of these cases, and in other cases, it's the entire structure of the church.
So I haven't seen artifacts left at the bases of the windows themselves, although I wouldn't be surprised if those kind of activities are happening. I think these stained glass windows are drawing acts of pilgrimage and have been for quite some time now. So this particular window, as I say, gets rededicated in 46. In the years that follow, and especially as you get into the 1980s and 1990s, when veterans are aging, where they're retired, maybe some amongst them have time and money on their hands, they're able to make that journey back to England. St Andrew's Church is a draw to them, and going to see the stained glass window is a draw to them. And it's often the church is the focal point for whatever ceremonies and rituals might be kind of caught up with, might be involved in that particular return. So yeah, absolutely, I think these windows have been focal points for acts of pilgrimage, of war pilgrimage.
It's difficult now because so many of these small churches are locked. They're not open because they're not staffed, and there's a lack of funding. We'll maybe talk in a few minutes about how this greater pilgrimage movement that's happening in Britain may be an opportunity for these churches as pilgrims are reconceptualizing pilgrimage in a variety of ways. I can imagine that these particular stained glass windows or windows like them or other elements of these churches might become a focal point for some pilgrims.
Yeah. No, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, as you were talking there, it just got me thinking. And if people listening into this want to sort of visualize some of this stuff, so talking about a window a moment ago, Quidnam, another really striking memorial window, and as you were talking there, you got me thinking about this one, is in a little village in the county of Northamptonshire, and it's called Grafton Underwood. And the connection here is that it's one of the relatively few in which the local community has made a real point in drawing attention to its presence. So it's actually signposted on some of the roads in and around the village. And as you drive into the village, there's a sign that literally says USAAF memorial window or something along those lines to make sure that people passing through are aware that it's there and that they can go check it out.
Your forthcoming book may be a bit of a guidebook then in this way.
Exactly
for people who might be interested in these sites. You've also recently published a piece a week or so ago. We're at the beginning of July, called War Grave Diplomacy: American Expeditionary Force Burials in Britain and the Transatlantic Politics of Mourning, 1918 to 1924. I really want to get into a discussion about this. And I think it's probably prudent to pause before we do that to define some terms that have come to define your work. And those terms are war grave diplomacy and memory diplomacy. And I want to hear straight from the source how you conceptualize these terms.
Sure. So these are terms I've come around to, and I haven't coined memory diplomacy. I think a few scholars have used it out there, but they're terms that I've come around to on the back of the work that we've already talked about here. So my book, Allies in Memory, was looking at what I called the politics of transatlantic commemoration. And since then, and after that was published back in 2015, I've become increasingly interested in various other forms and examples of what I like to think of as diplomatic activity, often happening at the grassroots, at a local level. So the kind of diplomatic encounters that might see Americans and Britons gather in a small parish church in 1946, which often gets overlooked because, understandably, I think diplomatic historians, myself included at times, we're often drawn to the encounters of prime ministers and presidents. And of course, those are important. But what strikes me about some of the activity that has drawn my attention over the last 10, 15 years or so now is that these two are diplomatic encounters. They bring together peoples from different nations and different cultures. They force them to combine, to collaborate, to cooperate on doing something, whether it be the raising of a monument or some kind of commemorative, ceremonial, ritualistic activity. And in doing so, this is international relations on the ground, happening in real time, and involving people beyond the corridors of power in the White House or in Whitehall in the UK. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in memory diplomacy writ large, yes, but I'm really interested in memory diplomacy as happening in, with site specificity, happening in particular geographic locale, involving specific communities, and also having a very kind of time-specific quality to it as well. And that's where the pilgrimage and the memorial building comes in, because it really takes your focus down to things happening at a particular time and place.
We definitely share that in common. This is a big draw for me also. Have you found in your research that often if we look at the memorial component, but then the pilgrimages, oftentimes there is a catalyst that happens to be a dual national or was maybe born in one country and then comes to the US. In the case that I've been studying over the past couple of years, these are often families who have French origins and they've come to the US, or one of the parents is from France, one is from the US. And so they're sort of they're an embodied kind of binational relationship. Is that the case for the research that you have been doing? Or what can you say about that?
To a degree, sometimes in places, the one that comes to mind instantly for me here is something I talked about in the article you mentioned a moment ago. Some of the key individuals involved in the activities around American war graves in England in and around 1918, so at the end of the First World War. Some of the organizations involved were groups of American expatriates in the UK. And for instance, there were groups of expatriate American women who had actually been very active in the UK during the course of the war itself, setting up hospitals and such. And in the post-18 period, some of those groups also become active in the pilgrimage activity, that is in the looking after of the graves, the war graves that then are themselves at the centre of the pilgrimage activity. So there's a little bit of that, but that's a really good question. I'm trying to think now if I can think of any other kind of specific dual nationals. Not off the top of my head. I'll have to give some thought to that one.
I'm thinking of an example in the inverse, and I didn't look up the exact details before this recording because it just popped into my head. So I want to make sure I give enough generalities here so that I don't get trapped by something that is in error. But sort of the gist is, and I don't know if I sent you this newspaper article, a soldier of an officer of the Yankee Division. So this situation is occurring, I want to say in maybe 1920, is the son of a British military officer who has immigrated to the United States, and they establish a monument, probably in Massachusetts. It might have been Connecticut. And so there's this commemoration ceremony that's happening, and it's quite moving. To see the Yankee Division soldier. His father is there, who was a British officer, and then the other soldiers, veterans, gathered at this. And I think that they were actually commemorating the American Revolution. So it's all packed in together in this one photo.
Yeah, and again, you've nudged my memory there. A similar type of individual, I guess, is General Thomas North. So General Thomas North is a key figure in the American Battle Monuments Commission after the Second World War. So yeah, if you look at the records of the ABMC in the National Archives, his name recurs and recurs and recurs. He's a real driving force behind the Commission's activity in the post-45 period. And he's a Brit by birth. He's British by birth. He then I think moves to the US in and around the First World War, serves in the United States Army during the First World War. Obviously, takes American citizenship, and then goes on to become a key figure in the work of the ABMC in the second half of the 20th century. So there's another example of a transatlantic individual involved in this kind of activity.
Yes, and the mobility and the importance of the homeland. There's I think this stays alive in immigrant communities who want to remain connected to their place of birth, and if they're individuals who have the power and resources to do so, then these types of memorials and then follow-on pilgrimages are exactly the way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So All right, so we've talked about how you conceptualize war grave diplomacy. Let's get into talking about your article. We started by discussing your work around the Second World War and after that period. So this takes us back to after the First World War and the activities of Americans coming through or coming to England in these years right after the end of the First World War.
Exactly so. And so what's kind of happened in my research career over probably the last decade or so is having written the book about post-45 activities, I then got interested in, okay, well, what's the situation in and around the First World War and in the post-1918 period? And as I dug further into that, it got for me more and more interesting because the history of the American presence in World War II Britain has been much discussed and debated. There's a big scholarship out there, rightly so, because it's an enormous moment in transatlantic history and in British social history. In comparative terms, the First World War experience has received far less attention. And often it's the case that the American presence in First World War Britain has been kind of sidelined or marginalized for reasons that on one level I can understand, because, it's not the front. And it is absolutely the case that if 1 million American soldiers pass through Britain between 1917 and 1919, and they do, 1 million pass through, a good quota of that million will indeed just pass through and might only be there for 10 days, or maybe sometimes even less time than that. Nonetheless, my interest or my argument is that that's still an enormously significant moment of transatlantic encounter. And it's also the case that if most of the million pass through, at any point in time by the summer of 1918, there's about 40 to 50,000 Americans resident in Britain, which is small fry compared to the presence in France, absolutely. But compared to the prior history of Anglo-American encounter, this is unprecedented. And so trying to recover the kind of significance of this in its moment. So that AEF presence in England during the First World War, and getting into that then got me thinking about, okay, what does the legacy of that presence look like? Hence my recent article on the war graves.
Mm-hmm. The Gold Star mothers also, those who had sons that were buried in England also, there was a pilgrimage, at least one delegation. You probably know more about this, to England. What was it, one or two?
At least two that I've seen, and there might even be three. But okay. Yes, you're absolutely, yeah.
So that's a little later. This is 1930 to 1933, and the parameters for your article are 1918 to 24. But you do get into talking about the issue of repatriation or leaving remains buried in the cemeteries. And so I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, you're right. So one of the reasons why that chronology is there in the title is because the article is most interested in telling recovering the history of how many Americans were buried in First World War Britain, and what happened to those burials once the war was done. Because you'll know this, Heather, that the US government policy after 1918 was that it would be the choice of next of kin where their loved ones would remain in perpetuity. So some stayed in the UK, but the numbers here are interesting. So at the end of the war in November of 1918, there's around about 2,500 American service personnel buried in the British Isles. Today, there are about 468 of those burials still in the UK at the official ABMC cemetery, which is at Brookwood in Surrey. And then there's approximately about another 20 burials which are scattered around the country at the original place of interment at the specific request of the loved ones involved. So I was interested in the article and kind of figuring out what happened there. How do we get from 2,500 to then, just shy of 470 that are now at the ABMC cemetery? And it's a story, as you've intimated, of exhumation and of repatriation and of reburial and of consolidation. And one of the consequences of that that I tried to talk about in the article is, well, what it would mean for the local communities, because in some instances where the process of exhumation and repatriation is kind of completed between 1922 and 1924, but it means that in some places there has been American burials in a local churchyard for 2, 3, 4 years or so. And in so many instances, those burials were embraced by the local community. They became our boys. They were marked with flowers. There were ceremonies every Armistice Day and every Memorial Day. So the article's kind of trying to tell the story of those lesser known activities.
Yeah, because the local people played a role in this grand story, and their work and their service and their um, emotional investment was quite high. And I can imagine that it would be a bit disruptive to the local narrative, but disruptive individually, psychologically, to the individuals who took great care to ensure that a plot in a local cemetery was given for these service members.
Absolutely so. A couple of examples that always come to mind when I think about this. So there's a tiny little village in Devon, in southwest England, in North Devon, southwest England. It's called Combe Martin, in 1918 it received an American burial because I think it was a Coast Guard vessel just off the coast, which very sadly, very tragically exploded, and a body was washed ashore at the village. And the local people, claimed that body. They gathered that body. It was as a young U.S. officer, U.S. naval officer, a lieutenant, and they took him as one of their own. They buried him in the local churchyard, and he stayed there for quite some time, until ultimately his next of kin requested his relocation. I think because they were worried about whether he would continue to be cared for in quite the same way going forward. There's a little snapshot there of a moment of transatlantic encounter just at this tiny little village. And the other one that comes to mind is on a slightly bigger scale. So those 2,500 burials that are in the UK by the end of November 1918, American burials that is, the vast majority of those are deaths a result of a couple of things. One is influenza. So the influenza pandemic, which sweeps through both sides of the Atlantic in 1918, 1919. So it's a good quota that are killed by flu. But the other big death toll is from the sinking of ships. So two American troop ships, the Tuscania and the Otranto, go down just off the Western Isles of Scotland. And you've got tiny little island communities there which find themselves having to deal with hundreds of American bodies washing up on their shoreline. And the stories of how they respond to that are incredibly powerful, incredibly poignant. And as a result, one thing that happens when the process of repatriation is underway later is that some of those locals, they don't want those bodies to go because they pulled them from the surf and buried them and looked after them, and they want them to stay.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, it's their own child or brother or husband, especially in the case, I think, for families who also lost one of their own sons. There is a deep emotional attachment to finding the son of someone else.
Yeah, there's a bit of transference in there, a bit of surrogacy, this sense of
Right.
my boy's buried overseas, but this body is here.
Yes. How do you? I'm thinking about. Well, I alluded to the fact that pilgrimages are growing in Britain, maybe more so than any other single country, I think, in the world at the moment. It seems like pilgrimage is becoming so much a part of the fabric of British life. And I'm wondering about your thoughts. Well, I'd love to hear about your thoughts about that on its own, but also how this intersects with some of the war graves and military cemeteries that are in Britain.
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment. I think you're right. There's a sense in Britain that there's a real interest in pilgrimage as in a very kind of diverse sense. So not necessarily just in a kind of established, ritualistic religious sense, but almost like that some people are interested. I sometimes think of myself in this regard as well. I'm kind of sacralizing the secular, of finding ways to make journeys significant and important. Every summer, I wouldn't refer to it as a pilgrimage, but every summer I go home. I go back to Suffolk and I cycle the routes that I cycled 20 years ago. And there's a ritualistic quality to that, which is partly expressive of me. But I think I'm caught up with some bigger trends and changes at the moment. And where's it coming from and what it's about? That's always a tricky one. And here is where I like to play my historian and professionally trained to tell you what happened in the past, and really bad at telling you what's happening right now. But that notwithstanding, I think it speaks about some of the kind of uncertainties and challenges and changes in 21st century Britain, and an attempt to reconnect with something meaningful and to reconnect with place and locale and landscape. Yeah, it's really striking.
I was interested to see that the British Pilgrimage Trust includes the Cambridge American Cemetery on one of their itineraries. Their Cambridge, there's I think a 1 day pilgrimage in a day, something like this. And the cemetery is along that route, which definitely piqued my curiosity. And I wonder about your thoughts around how these places, well, what does this do to a pilgrimage narrative when there's a cemetery and a military cemetery in particular folded in to an itinerary? It's sort of, we just accept it as a fact. We accept as fact that this military cemetery is a sacred site and therefore it should be included in a 1 day pilgrimage.
We absolutely do, and that's a consequence, I guess, on one level of stuff that you're really familiar with. I know, Heather, the idea of pilgrimage and its relationship with sites of conflict and of war memory, especially since 1918, and that kind of connection which has been increasingly kind of hardwired together, that to go on pilgrimage is for some to go to a site of conflict and battle and go to a cemetery. And in the UK, it's going to the battlefield cemeteries of the Western Front is a very well known, and I hesitate to use the word popular, but there is a popularity to that endeavour. It's something that lots of UK school kids do as well. My own daughter, when she was in year 7, which is about the equivalent of US grade 7, she and her school, they went to the First World War battlefields. They go to a cemetery. They laid a wreath at the Menin Gate. But that kind of sense that a war cemetery is a rightful place of pilgrimage is firmly established, and so, as you say, on one level, it makes sense that it features in that itinerary that you've identified there, because there's a familiarity to that. This is a sacred space, and it's on the itinerary.
Mm-hmm. Was your daughter's trip to the Western Front called a pilgrimage?
It wasn't, to my knowledge. So yeah, it wasn't specifically called that, as you might expect from kind of activities happening in the 1920s. But if you look at the detail, as I'm inclined to do, and the kind of the structure and the itinerary and the activities, it
follows
so much.
the template, doesn't it?
It does.
There's a commemoration piece, a commemorative piece. There's a bit of a remembrance piece. The students probably studied about particular soldiers, and so they have this in mind, and they're walking in their footsteps. And then I suppose there's probably a reflective piece when they're at an actual grave. So
exactly, all of that, and it makes me think of, I think it's the Tony Walter article, Your War Grave Pilgrimage. Yes, that lovely idea of one way to think about, is something a pilgrimage or not, does it have a moment of emotional catharsis, or a point of, as you've described there, a point of reflection. And I think the activities that we're describing here that my daughter is involved in do sort of and tally with that kind of definition.
So what are you working on now? I mean, I've sort of mentioned, and you've mentioned about a new book that's forthcoming, and I want to hear all about that.
So a couple of things I'm working on at the moment. One is sort of with the press, and is going through a production process right now, and I'm hopeful that it might be out before the end of this year. If not, it will be out in early 2027. And the book is, as you guessed earlier, it is a guidebook. It's a guidebook to the US 8th Air Force sites of memory and of mourning that can be found in England, and largely in Eastern England. And it's got that's what it says on the tin kind of title. It's commemorating the 8th Air Force. And it's coming out with McFarland. And it's been a bit of a labour of love, but kind of personal passion project. It's something I've done. I've co-written it with my dad, because he and I have been going to so many of these sites together and for so many years now. So we thought we'd team up on this. So so there's that forthcoming. But the next kind of big, substantive, research-informed book that I'm working on is all about the American Expeditionary Force in World War One, Britain and Ireland. So Britain and Ireland, that kind of that dual focus. Majority Britain, because that's where most of the AEF were, but there was a significant US presence in Cork and in Belfast, so that'll feature as well. So working on that at the moment, and it's just at the stage where I've got about 2 or 3 chapters done. I'm just about to send off a couple of those chapters to my editor. Hopefully he'll say yay and he likes, and it can progress from there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, really enjoying that. It's been with me now, this project, since pre-COVID, delayed by a tour as head of department and head of school and various other jobs, and then the pandemic itself. So I'm really looking forward to bringing this home over the next 6 months or so.
Will you be getting into the post-war pilgrimages at all?
I will. So the very final chapter, it's a 5-chapter book. That's how I'm seeing it at the moment. The very final chapter, which is actually one of the 2 or 3 that I've written, takes the story into the post-18 period. And it revisits some of the bits and pieces that I've talked about in the article that we've discussed today, but also is a slightly broader piece as well. And I identify some of the sites of interest and of pilgrimage that draw Americans to them in the 1920s. So the ABMC Cemetery at Brookwood in Surrey, Soulgrave Manor in Northamptonshire, which is the ancestral home of George Washington, is set up as, in the language at the moment, a shrine to the Anglo-American Alliance, and dedicated in 1921. So, and then I also talk about some of the various war grave sites and burials, a big American monument in the Western Isles of Scotland as well. So I kind of trail off, I kind of close the story off as we get into the early 1930s with the Gold Star Mother pilgrimages. So they do feature, and that's where I kind of start drawing the line in about sort of 1933 or so.
I think the 1927 American Legion pilgrimage, I believe they stopped in England. And certainly the 1929 Yankee Division pilgrimage stopped in England on the way to France. And I'm also thinking about, was it 1919 that Woodrow Wilson went to France and he stopped at his childhood home in England on the way to France? Was it 1919 or 1918?
It's at the very end of 1918, so literally the final days of December 1918, and then he's over to France for the Versailles Peace Conference. Yeah, you're right. Which is this features in this chapter as well. It's a fascinating episode. I've previously written something about it because I found it so intriguing, as you will as well. How Wilson described that journey. He referred to it as a pilgrimage of the heart.
He did, because it was very much about his identity and returning to his own ancestral home. Exactly. While he's also on this diplomatic mission to France.
Exactly so. He goes to 3 places in the UK before he then goes to Paris. And the 3 places are London for meetings with King George and Lloyd George, Prime Minister Lloyd George, and predictable and understandable. The other 2 locations, though, are both in northern England. One is Manchester, because he's a fan of the Manchester Guardian newspaper, and he likes Manchester. He thinks it's a good transatlantic city, and he gives a speech at Manchester Free Trade Hall to that effect. This is an American city, and I like it. And the other place he goes to is Carlisle, which is on the England-Scotland borders, because that's where his mother is from, and he's welcomed there, and there's a ceremony in the local church in Carlisle as well. Yeah, that's Wilson's December 1918 Pilgrimage of the Heart.
Did he write about this? I've only found newspaper accounts. It's not been a pilgrimage that I've delved into really, except that I know that it exists. But I'd be curious if he kept a journal or diary during this time.
So it features, so references to it feature in his personal papers, which obviously have all been collated and collected together and have published. It's picked up certainly by contemporary press. It receives a lot of coverage both in print media, also a bit of photography, and I think probably some newsreel footage at some point as well, though I don't think I've been able to track that down. I don't think he wrote about it at any real length, but I might be wrong, and I'd have to go back to my own things. I read it about 4 or 5 years ago to remind myself there. He gives a good speech at Carlisle, so he writes about it in that speech.
Yes.
And it's also I think it's either his 5th or 6th visit to England, because he's a huge fan of the English Lake District, which is very close. Although interestingly, this is the time he goes to Carlisle. So despite the fact he's been to the English Lake District about 4 or 5 times to make a pilgrimage to the landscape of Wordsworth, He doesn't actually just head a little bit further north to Carlisle until December of 1918.
That I think that journey in and of itself is sort of captures the essence of pilgrimage, because it's on one hand always about someone's identity, whether that is their ancestral homeland or their identity as a member of uh, the 26th division, or something. A person is Catholic, so I think it's always about identity. There is this travel component that is leaving, of course, the routine, leaving home to go somewhere else. And also, typically, these journeys are combined with something else. It's in many cases combined with something more official, or something that seems like work. But then there's also this other piece of the heart, like it's that is also so important in these journeys. So it's an interesting case study, I think, on pilgrimages, especially during this era of time.
I think you're absolutely right, and it is really interesting little episode because as well it for me it kind of gives a sense of where the idea of pilgrimage is just then heading. So on one level, you could look at Wilson's visit to Carlisle in 1918 and say this is a type of transatlantic pilgrimage which is already pretty familiar by the 1880s, 1890s. So the idea of making a pilgrimage to the old country, especially amongst those in the US who understood themselves and the language of the moment as Anglo-Saxon, that's a recurrent theme of either side of 1900. It's a real popular thing. In fact, there are even books published about it. Of how to do a pilgrimage to England and where to go if you're going to make a pilgrimage to England. So on one level, Wilson's 1918 December visit is a little bit like that. But at the same time, it also starts kind of pointing us forward to what's about to happen over the subsequent decade, as now a whole nother generation of Americans, hundreds of thousands of them, have a renewed reason to cross the Atlantic, and it's about visiting the graves of their loved ones, or for the veterans returning to the battlefields where they fought. So it's this kind of really interesting moment of kind of crossover, of intersection.
Wilson also, during this pilgrimage, stopped at Bella Wood, and he characterized it in sort of this dark, mangled, gloomy place where Americans have sacrificed. And this kind of language, this evocative language, also, I think, was critical in compelling these veterans to return, and definitely in the early 1920s, those family members who had the resources in order to make such a pilgrimage, that seeing this type of narrative in print, I think also was a large impetus in driving them over to France.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I think it's something that I've noted in some of the veterans pilgrimages that I've studied, both after 45, but also now in the 1920s as well. The extent to which contemporary press coverage offered these journeys a language, a way of understanding and kind of making sense of what was at work here is really important. So on one level, the press, the print media are reporting and describing, but on another level, they're also themselves almost encouraging and catalyzing and giving the pilgrims themselves the language to make sense of what it is that they're doing.
I think from a psychological perspective, I mean, even Joseph Campbell is kind of writing. He actually is in Paris in 1927. I've not found a direct link to whether he's witnessing the return of these American veterans, but it stands to reason he was aware of their presence. He's writing about the hero's journey at this point, and I think this is also where the press really contributes to the narrative of these American soldiers, service members going into like the depths of hell and then coming back out. And this kind of arc of the hero's journey, I mean, it's a literary arc, it's a narrative that is really resonating, I think, with a lot of people during this time. I think this also And then also the idea of the Gold Star mother being her own kind of hero, where she's coming to reenact the journey of her son, I think is important. So the press contributes to this arc in, I think, significant ways.
Mm. But at the same time, you're absolutely right that there's a bigger, broader, older literary trope at work here. The return of the soldier. I
Yes.
think even Rebecca West, I think, writes a book in the 20s called The Return of the Soldier. And of course, given the movie that's about to come out on both sides of the Atlantic, that classic story of a soldier returning from battle. Yeah, there's something of that very well established literary trope in these activities and how press are reporting them as well.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me about your work and about your views on war grave diplomacy and memory diplomacy, and the publications that you have coming out in the next couple of months, and then into probably later 2027 or 2028. It's been fantastic to have a chance to speak with you, and hopefully this will be the beginning of many conversations.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you. Always interesting and enjoyable to talk about these things with a fellow and like-minded person. So I really appreciate it.